Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's Connect Group Bible Study. This week we had Tim Hughes, the worship leader, songwriter and pastor of Gas Street Church in Birmingham with us. And he spoke in the mornings and then we interviewed him in the evening. And so if you didn't get to hear either the morning or the evening, do go and check them out online. But we're going to look at the passage, one of the passages that he looked at in the morning, which is Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through to 15. So have a read of that and then come back here and we're going to have a look at it together. So I hope you found that helpful. So Tim entitled his talk, If Not You, Then Who? If not you, then who? And started by looking at this idea that a leader is somebody who takes responsibility. Leadership is not sort of just like a descriptor. It's a doing. It's like a verb. It's not an adjective. If you're not actually leading, if you're not actually taking responsibility, then there's a big question around, are we actually doing what Jesus told us to do? And obviously that will look differently in every different context. But this story is quite an interesting one. This is Moses just before he sort of is known, before he's done anything great. And in a sense, this is sort of a calling story, but it's also a story of getting things wrong. So we read this. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at the hard labor. Now, Moses doesn't have to work in this way because he's basically a prince in Pharaoh's palace. You may know the story. He gets adopted as a young child into the palace, but his people are basically slaves in Egypt and being forced to work on building sites, building projects for the Egyptians. And it says this: he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people, and looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, this is kind of the setup to the story. And the interesting thing here is that this verse 12, looking this way and that and seeing no one, it's quite hard to translate, and really one of the other renderings that you could look at it as this is looking this way and that and seeing no one else willing to intervene, because a building site would rarely be empty. There's the guy who was being beaten up for a start, and Moses and probably others, but he sees nobody else who's willing to take a stand, willing to stand up for those being victimized. There's sort of in the Hebrew, you get this line, the Egyptian man, the Hebrew man, and then seeing no man willing to step up. And it's a question really, what is our role when we see a man victimize another? When we see somebody victimized, what is our role? Are we just bystanders, or are we people who step up and get involved? And so the first question really is around responsibility. If a leader is one who takes responsibility, I'd love you to start by making a list of things that you're currently responsible for. Obviously, this starts with things in our own life, and then in our family and our friends, and in our workplace and in our ministry. But it'd be really helpful just to list some of those things that you're responsible for, and then maybe talk about that. Maybe there were some things that as you started to do this list surprised you, or as you share your list with each other, there'll be things you think, oh, that I have like responsibilities like that too. Then would love you to chat about whether or not you struggle with false guilt. This is where things that you feel responsible for, but are actually not your responsibility. Grounded leaders have a sense of the locus of control. And here, obviously, Moses, the passage makes it clear that these are his own people repeated there, that this is something that he's supposed to take responsibility for. It's in his locus of control. So if you struggle with sort of false guilt around feeling over responsible for things, just share a bit of that, because that can be helpful to talk about. And also a key question is, where might God be asking you to take responsibility? Where might God be asking you to take responsibility? So have a chat around those three questions and then join us when you're done. Okay, so just before we move on, one area that I'd love to challenge you all in is that the children's church is growing massively. We're seeing amazing things happening there. And we're constantly trying to recruit new leaders and train them up to disciple the next generation of followers of Jesus, leaders in our nation. And so if that's something that you've ever felt, maybe I feel called to invest in the children or the youth, and that might be in a role of teaching, might be in a role of childcare or admin or any of those. That's one of our key needs as a church at the moment. And so do be praying as to whether or not there's anything that you could take responsibility for in that area of HTBB. Now, the next thing we see in this story is that Moses is emboldened. So the next day, he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. And he asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" Now, this is really interesting. In Hebrew literature, the first dialogue assigned to a character is often sort of defines who they are. It often is a picture of the rest of the story kind of summed up in one line. And Moses' first words are a rebuke of a fellow Israelite, and he's using legal terms. And obviously Moses is known for bringing the law. But really this is sort of the embryonic form of his calling we see here. And often as we look at our own calling journeys, often we'll see things that rarely ever does God just pluck things out of the blue. Often we look back and we see that our story makes sense as he journeys with us and calls us into what he has for us. Now the problem is, the man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" Awkward answer there is God, but that comes later. And he says, "Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have been known." See, obviously we'd agree that standing up in the face of injustice is good, but really Moses here lets his anger escalate things. In Romans it says human anger is unable to bring about the kind of righteousness that God desires. And obviously he sees something wrong, but his anger escalates it, not eye for an eye, but eye for an earlobe, and he sees somebody beating and he kills him. And this really is a leadership fail. I'm not sure what your HR policy is on murder in the workplace. Hopefully it's illegal. And really what he does here is it's the right work, but in the wrong way. You can't separate the work of Jesus from the way of Jesus. Jesus doesn't just say, "I'm going to show you how to do things." He says, I am the way. This is the way you are to live this life. And we see this play out through this. Really, it's a character fail that he lets his anger get the better of him. He kills this guy. And we see that it undermines his calling. That really he's here to sort of say, what are you doing? This guy is in the wrong, but his failure means he struggles to now be effective. Character fails make it harder to influence and lead others. This is the problem. Your competency will get you to a certain level, but it's your character that keeps you there. And there's a really, this is the problem when we don't invest in our character. Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have been known." We want to lead in the daylight. It's been said, great advice is never put anything in writing you'd be unhappy to see on the front page of the Star. Don't say anything probably that you'd be unhappy to be repeated to that person. Lead in the daylight, because when we lead in the darkness, fear takes over you, and it undermines what God is calling you to. So I suppose the second question here is, are there any times when you've got the work right, but you've not got the way right? When have you got the work, but not the way right? Have you had a time where you knew what the right thing was to do, but maybe your anger or your self-righteousness got in the way? I know that's a problem for me. Moses' heart was in the right place, but his hands weren't. There are moments when I'm sure I know in my experience where I've tried to fix things and I've actually made them worse. Social media makes this so challenging because you scroll through your feed and you see one injustice after another, all often outside of our locus of control. But if you've had a moment where I wonder where you've got things that you've got the way wrong, even if the work was right. What was the impact, and how did you make amends? Or maybe you're in the middle of a situation now where you've not got things right. Maybe it's a good time to ask each other's opinion about how you can make things how you can amend things. This is almost a form of confession, and the promise with confession is, as we confess our sins to one another, God brings healing to our lives. So when have you got the work but not the way right? Okay, and lastly, we read, when Pharaoh heard this, he tried to kill Moses. That was Pharaoh's HR policy on this. If you kill one of his people, he'll kill you. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. And really here, I mean, this is just the saddest thing. He was a prince in the most powerful country in the world, and he ends up a fugitive in exile, living with nomad shepherds who are the lowest of the low. Where he was at the start and where at the end couldn't be further apart. But really, this is part of the cost of being a leader. Leadership is costly, and obviously this is a picture of Jesus, who was a prince and he becomes a shepherd. He gives it all up in taking responsibility. And key with Jesus, he takes responsibility for that which was not his fault. He takes responsibility for our sin, and it costs him giving up his prince and his power to become like a shepherd and then dying on a cross. But what the wonderful thing is with Moses here is this looks like an awful place to be, but actually it's in this place that God is getting him ready for his ultimate calling, and to not just save one Israelite, but to save the whole nation. And not by taking things into his own hand, but by actually going, God, you're going to have to do this. And it's really beautiful here. He sat down by a well. And he probably is down in the dumps. But actually, if you go back through the story in Genesis, wells are key. There are places where people meet with these people. Place of romance as well. Abraham's servant met Rebecca, Jacob met Rachel, and Moses is about to meet his wife. But it's a place where we might think we're at the lowest of the low, and actually God's meeting us there. And so whatever season you find yourself in, this is a place where God wants to work on your character, work on your competency, to lead you into what he has for you, and the call he has for your life. Pray for one another, share what's going on. Maybe you want to answer the question, if not you, then who? And ask, where might God be asking you to be taking responsibility? Have a great time praying for each other. Have a great week, and see you next Sunday.